If I can ask you guys to take your seats, and we'll get started. We understand there have been some traffic issues out there, and so we may still have some stragglers coming in. I don't know what's going on in town tonight that isn't us, but I'm Kath Kasdan, Princeton Class of '85, member of the board of directors at Princeton Alumni Corps, and also the program leader for the Community Volunteers Program, which is sponsoring this event tonight. So I just want to thank everybody for coming. And I'll tell you just a little bit about Princeton Alumni Corps and our various programs. Then I'm going to turn it over to Rachel Benevento, who's the program director for Community Volunteers, and she will then turn it over to our wonderful panel. So what is Princeton Alumni Corps? So Princeton Alumni Corps is about inspiring and building civic leadership among alumni across generations and engaging them in significant activities that influence and impact our society. So we have a number of different programs that really build capacity for organizations, and you'll hear about some of those specific ones tonight. Before I get into the specific programs, I did want to recognize, I think we've got the full complement of the staff here tonight. So Andrew Nurkin, who's the executive director for Princeton Alumni Corps, Rachel Benevento, who will talk to you in a minute, who's our program director for Community Volunteers. In the back, Sandy Fernandez, who's our new development director. And then we've got Paul, who is responsible for our Princeton Project 55 Fellowship Program, and Lisa in the back, who's our office manager. So feel free to talk to them afterwards about if you're interested in any of the specific programs or activities. So how do we inspire and promote civic engagement? We have a number of programs. What we're probably best known for, which is really the founding program of the organization, founded by the Princeton class of 1955. It's a program called Princeton Project 55. It's a fellowship program for graduating or recent graduates of Princeton University, and it places them in year-long fellowships in various nonprofit organizations in various communities around the country, and they get to really learn firsthand about those nonprofit organizations very early in their careers. So that's really our sort of signature program. Expanding from that, we have our Emerging Leaders Program, which is a relatively new program, where we've taken people who've been in the nonprofit sector for a few years and are starting to move into management positions, and it's really a leadership development program, much needed in the nonprofit sector, a program that's really focused on nonprofit leadership. And by the way, there's information about all these programs in the back that you can pick up. Then another program we have is called the Alumni Network, where basically we take the fellowship program idea that we spawned at Princeton University, and we've worked with a lot of other institutions around the country to help them foster similar programs at their colleges or universities. And then finally, Community Volunteers, which again is sponsoring the event tonight, where we look for folks who have had experience in the working world, either in the nonprofit or for-profit sector, and want to give back to their community by working on meaningful capacity building projects on a pro bono basis with nonprofit organizations. And actually tonight, a couple of the panelists actually have some programs that we are helping them staff with community volunteers. I also want to mention that I am actually a volunteer with Community Volunteers, and so I've sort of taken this on as my project, and really to help the organization, help Princeton Alumni Corps build this strategy and build our capacity to work with nonprofit organizations. So again, you're going to hear a lot more about these kinds of programs. I'm going to turn it over to Rachel to tell you more about this evening's program.
Thank you, everybody, for coming from near and far. We're really excited that you're here tonight, and as Kath said, she volunteers with us, and we definitely could not do all that we did without her and her strategic direction and all of her input, so thank you, Kath. So as she mentioned, with Community Volunteers, we have a list over on the table of open volunteer projects, and we are hope that you all will be inspired to potentially volunteer with us. There's some great organizations here. As Kath mentioned, you'll hear about a couple of them from our panelists. And we're also very pleased to have Randy Kirkpatrick here, who's representing CASA. That's Court-Appointed Special Advocates. It's an amazing organization that helps out children in the foster care system. So we have projects as well with CASA, and after the formal part of the evening is over in the panel, you'll have an opportunity to talk with the our panelists and Randy from the organizations. And I would like to now turn it over to Elyse Powell, who's Princeton class of 11, and she's one of our former Princeton Project 55 fellows. She works at the New York Academy of Medicine, and she was, we're very grateful that she came in from New York just to moderate our panel tonight. So thank you so much for being here, and I'm going to now turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. So I guess we should just dive in. And I'd love to have all of our panelists introduce themselves and talk a little bit about how you got involved in what you currently do. You want to start? Go for it.
My name is Eric Clark, and I work with a nonprofit in Lambertville called, we call it SPLASH, which stands for Student Participation in Learning Aquatic Science and History. Our connection with Princeton goes to Bart Hobel, who was a faculty member here at the Department of Psychology since 1963, I just found out before coming here. So nearly 50 years. He passed last summer and got a lot of international renown for his research in food addiction, actually, in the brain. So very interesting. But his graduate students would tell me in the spring, you can't, don't look for him in the lab, he's going to be up in Lambertville working on the steamboat, which was very close to his heart. And so I got connected with Bart when I came back to the area a few years ago, and because I grew up with Bart's children and his wife, and soon found myself on the board and on board teaching, so one other quick story I always tell about Bart in Princeton is that if you are familiar with the P-Raid every year, he was at the head of it, except the last 2 years, in his steam calliope, which he built on top of an antique fire truck. And so he had just lots and lots of interests, but he's very connected to Princeton.
I'm Jeff Rozalski. I'm Executive Director of the Pocono Environmental Education Center, and we're an independent, nonprofit environmental ed center in Dingman's Ferry, Pennsylvania. We're one of the largest environmental education centers in the country. About 24,000 people a year come and use the center. And we sit in a national park in the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area. We've been there for about 40 years. And we teach children and adults about appreciation for nature, environmental science, sustainability, things like that. And we're a residential center, so we actually have accommodation on our campus for 330 people across 40 some odd buildings. And you know, most people come for multi-day environmental education trips. And so we have a series of 30 classes that we offer. You can choose what you want, everything from elementary school through to college, and then we do some graduate school programs as well, mainly serving New York, New Jersey, and Philadelphia areas. A lot of urban schools, urban high schools, and elementary schools and middle schools come to us, and have for, you know, some have been coming for 35 years every year. And then on weekends we do adult programs. We bring in wildlife photographers, that sort of thing. You know, we have hiking trails on the campus, and although we sit in a national park, we're an independent 501c3 nonprofit, and so 80% of our operating dollars come from user fees. The balance are grants and donations, so that the state of Pennsylvania in which we sit and nor the federal government actually give us any operating funds. But the other thing, which is kind of pivotal to the work we do, is the volunteers that help us out. And in fact, that was sort of the beginning of my journey at Peak. So I started out, let's see, I'm class of '85, Princeton as well, as Kev. I started out as an English major in college. And so, you know, have, on the face of it, no particular qualifications to do, to run an environmental education center. Although I did take organic chemistry and things like that when I was at Princeton. But then my journey kind of after college was I went to China and lived in Shanghai for a year on a Princeton Asia Fellowship and studied Mandarin, and then came back to New York City in 1986 and had no money, needed a job, and the only places that were hiring at the time in a serious way were investment banks. So I'd taken Econ 101 at Princeton, and thought, well, I lived overseas, I took Econ 101, someone should give me a job. And you know, I was very fortunate. I did get a job, had no idea what I was doing for the first year or so, but I spent 15 years as an investment banker in New York, in London, in Hong Kong, back to New York a couple of times. And you know, on one of those stints when I was in New York City, my wife and I decided we needed a weekend place. We're going to build a little 2-bedroom log cabin. And so we bought some property adjoining the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area for our little cabin. And one day I walked about a mile down the road and came across the Pocono Environmental Education Center. Loved what they were doing. By this time, you know, we'd eventually moved back to the U.S., had 3 kids, wanted to get them more involved, so I became a volunteer there. And spent 12 years as a volunteer, eventually becoming a trustee of the organization. And in the meantime, I had quit being an investment banker, had various other business interests, and eventually I had retired and I was bringing up my kids. And we had a board meeting for the Pocono Environmental Education Center, and trustees got together with the prior executive director, and succession planning was the discussion. He said he'd be around for 2 more years and was going to retire, and we all left the meeting and patted ourselves on the back. We'd done a good job as a board. And 2 months later, he quit. So I lived a mile down the road, and I thought, well, you know, I want to keep this place going. It's been going at that point for 30-some odd years, and I love what they were doing. And so I said, look, I'm going to step off the board, and I'm happy to keep the place running, and you guys do a search, and I'll just make sure everything keeps running. And after 2 months, they came back to me and said, well, actually, what we really want is you to run it full time. And I sort of took a deep breath, and 3.5 years later, I'm still running it. I think the greatest loser in the whole process was my wife, who lost her gardener, her chauffeur, her cook. But you know, I think I kind of summed it up best. You know, we had our 25th college reunion not too long ago, and they asked us for 6-word autobiographies. And my 6-word autobiography was, never thought I'd be doing this. And you know, but it really started as a volunteer opportunity that transformed into a second or really 4th career for me. And I love every minute of it. I love going to work. And the nice part about having the business background beforehand is things like doing budgets, projections, not really very challenging, if you've done these for much larger organizations, and it allows me to concentrate on the things that I really want to in terms of moving the organization forward. And it's taking these skills from a prior career or several other prior careers, and then applying them to a nonprofit organization that has been very, very, very rewarding, and something I wholeheartedly encourage.
I'm Seamus. I have a slight connection to Pete because my 2 youngest kids have been there since they could just about walk, and it's a tremendous and wonderful place. I have no connection whatsoever to Princeton. In fact, the last time I set foot on this campus was in 1974 for a Beach Boys concert when we broke the floor at Jadwin Gym. So maybe later we can try and do that here too. I write about the intersection of energy, the environment, and economics. In other words, I write about everything. Everything intersects in those things. I got into it when, not too many years ago, somebody knocked on the door of my family farm to inform us that we were sitting on top of the 3rd largest natural gas field in the world. It opened up an avenue of investigation for me, which came into this book. The book, called The End of Country, is about people trying to, it tells the story of my family, my neighbors, the people I grew up with, and what it's really about is about trying to come to terms with doing the right thing in a tremendously challenging situation, when the right thing is not always what you imagine it to be. Now, I'll let it go with that. I do want to answer the question that I know is foremost on everybody's mind, and that is, yes, I am aware of the fact that I showed up here looking like a member of a Village People tribute band. And there's a reason for that. It's because I probably traveled 20,000 miles in the course of the last year talking about the Marcellus, talking about energy, talking about the end of country. And by and large, I have done most of those 20,000 miles on a motorcycle, and there is a reason for that. Actually, there are two reasons for it. If you've read the book, or when you read the book, you'll realize that the first reason is that I'm in the throes of a truly epic midlife crisis, and have been since I was about 26. The other reason is that I get 50 miles to the gallon. And when we have this conversation about energy, the environment, and economics, one of the things that tends to get overlooked is the issue of conservation. And I was thinking today, and I'll just let it go with this, it's September 11th. And I'm sure a lot of us have been meditating on the events of 11 years ago. And when you meditate on those, it's probably worth meditating on all of the events that contributed to that in sort of a cascading flow, beginning with the toppling of our oil puppet in Iran, the Shah, and how the instability that came as a result of that led to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and how that led to the events that transpired on September 11th. And it's probably worth considering the role that oil played in not just those events, but in all the bloody events that have happened in the decade plus since. That's what I got.
Well, thank you. Now, each of you are connected in your own unique way to the Delaware water gap, right? And so I was hoping you could tell everyone one thing that everyone should know about the Delaware water gap, especially something maybe currently going on. Just a pop question.
Sure. First thing that we always make sure kids know when they come on board is, does anybody know how many people depend on the Delaware River for drinking water, other than here? We tell 17 million people, so it's a vital resource.
I guess I would say, we were talking before this began about the fact that the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area is the national park that is closest to New York City. It's 74 miles. It is 77,000 acres that sit on either side of the Delaware River, so part in New Jersey and part in Pennsylvania. That region has been at the crux of the equation of both power and water resources and transportation, basically since, since the Native Americans were here. I mean, it is, that the whole reason that park came into existence was because it was supposed to be dammed up with a hydroelectric dam at the bottom, water from New York City and Philadelphia, provide power, and it's very fortunate that it never turned into that for a number of reasons. But this started in the 60s. We're still facing the issue of use of water, need for power in the region, and how to preserve the natural resources and balance those against the needs for water and for power in a growing society.
Balance is the issue. Balance is the issue. My farm is about 80 miles to the west. I live not far from Jeff, and Jeff and I were talking about how at the northern end of sort of our region is the home of Gifford Pinchot, the first forester. And I've taught my kids this. I can literally walk. My house is built right square in the middle of an old logging trail. And I can walk, if I choose to, 27 miles from the back of my house to Gifford Pinchot's house and not cross a major road along the way. The other thing that I won't cross along the way is a tree. that would be older than my father. My father would be 80 years old this year. My friends from the city come up and visit me. They think I live in the forest primeval. They think I live in an absolute pristine place. And I do live in a place that is as lush and green as it has ever been, but it's not the same. It's not the same. The chestnuts are gone, the hemlocks are under attack, and yet it's regenerated. It's regenerated to the point where we now have perhaps 10 times as many deer as we had in 1682. We have bobcat, we have bear. Not far from where he is, there's even been rumors of mountain lions. Okay? I've gotten that from 2 sources now who I trust. Okay? It has regenerated. Not the same. I can ride 80 miles to the southwest from where I live. And there's a place called Centralia, Pennsylvania. If you want to see the concept of coal gasification in practice, that's what Centralia, Pennsylvania is. In 1964, a mine fire broke out in Centralia, Pennsylvania. It's still burning today. You can go there, the streets are there, the street signs are there, the front stoops of the houses are there, but there are no houses. You can go there in January, in February, when there's snow everywhere else, and put your hand on the ground. And it is hot to the touch. There's no sign when, if ever, that's going to end. There are stark choices that we face in this issue of energy and the use of resources like water, like gas. And ultimately those choices devolve. They really come down to a question of character. That's where we end up, whether we end up with the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area or Centralia's, is a question of character.
Thank you. And briefly before I open up to questions from the audience, each of you have taken a really central role in what it is that you do. What advice would you give to someone who maybe wants to get involved but doesn't have the time to take that large of a role on?
I can start with that. It's really
okay.
Just get involved in the most minor way you can. It doesn't matter. I mean, literally, giving a few hours to an organization that you're have some interest in. You have no idea where it's going to lead. I guess initially it was probably because my children were going to the day camp at Peak. I mean, my oldest is now 17. She started there when she was 4. A couple of years ago, she was a counselor there. Then my next one was a counselor there, and now this summer my third one was a volunteer counselor there. But they have learned so much from that organization, and there was that feeling of I just want to give something back. The joke in my family is that my wife, who has a degree in molecular biology, is actually the one, and was an outdoor action leader, is the one more qualified to run an environmental organization than I am. But I stepped in there, and I talked with my staff lets me teach canoeing, kayaking, and a couple of nature walks. But the serious hardcore environmental education, I have a staff that does that. It's not my area of expertise. I've got little sub areas of expertise. But I think you just go in there and you just start, and you volunteer your time. It doesn't have to be much to begin, and it will be greatly welcomed by whatever organization you come in and help out with.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and we are also very grateful for. There's a fellow, one of Bart's former colleagues, and he's in Cambridge now. So he can only come once a year, and he helps haul the boat out, and we are very grateful for that. But we are, it's kind of like being in the third world or something. There's all these guys pulling a hawser, pulling this big thing. So it's a lot of backs involved. But we are always looking for teachers, people who like boats, administrative people, and people who like to hold a paintbrush. Boats need a lot of work.
And we have Wynn and Elon with us today, right?
Good time to introduce
them?
Yeah, sure, okay. Elon Park is a Princeton PhD holder, and she just joined us actually the end of July, and is researching grants and writing grants, and in fact a real go-getter. She was teacher on one of our classes this summer already. So she knows her gumption, she did it. So we're very grateful for her. And Wynn Madrigal joined us before that. Wynn has her own media company, and I looked on LinkedIn today, Wynn, so 17 years of experience in U.S. and Far East print media, something she'll tell you about. And she's doing our new website, so we're very grateful for that.
Unless there's anything else we want to add, I'm happy to open it up for
By all means.
questions from the audience.
I have a question.
Go for it.
So it strikes me that each of you is in some way engaged in the enterprise of education as a means of activism, right? You're trying to affect some sort of consciousness change around the use of our natural resources and the way we produce and consume energy. Why education as opposed to some other venue or method of affecting the change that you're trying to achieve?
For me, it's yes, we're also a 501c3 educational nonprofit, and our mission really is working with school groups and actually seniors. We have seniors come; they're mostly interested in the history, as it turns out, but our core groups that come, they're working with a net and picking out the macroinvertebrates that are at the dock. When we're anchored out in the middle of the river in a beautiful section of the river there by Lewis Island, they reach into the river and take their samples and see the fish, see the birds. So it's a delivery platform. We're on an actual working steamboat. In case I didn't mention that, because that's one of the things that's unique. But it's you're actually in it, right? So that's a little different experience from school. You need both, of course, but that's what we're trying to do, trying to get a feeling for it so that you would want to protect it.
And I mean, ours is also a very hands-on education. I mean, it is not about kids coming to, our classroom is the national park. So yes, we do have an indoor space, but the kids, whether they're, muckraking at the ponds, whether they're hiking our trails on guided hikes, whether they're doing water sampling, for water quality, it's all hands-on. It's kind of like if we were in a science lab, it's all the lab part. It's none of the, not so much of the reading. And I guess, the reason education probably, there's so much more I want to learn that for me it's just, I'm ever inquisitive about things, but also about how people and how students of any age learn things and acquire information that actually sinks in. And I had a very traditional classroom education in terms of, and it was something I was good at, but I probably through my educational career did not have as much of the hands-on. And looking back, I think there are certain things I would have understood a lot more readily had they been taught to me in a different way. And I see how kids learn, and it's just intriguing to me.
Education is a big word for a guy who basically flunked out of college in his freshman year. I don't think of what I do as education. What I think of it as is trying to change the narrative. It is 40 years since we hit peak oil in this country. It's 30 years since Ronald Reagan ripped the solar panels off the White House, one of which is sitting in a museum in China right now. 20 years. It's 20 years since I was standing ankle deep in sand in the West Bank as a young reporter watching missiles fly across from Iraq toward Tel Aviv in the West Bank in the opening salvos of what is now a 20-year-long war for oil. And in that 20 years, in that 30 years, in that 40 years, we have done nothing to address our energy issues. We have done nothing to address our environmental issues as a result of them. And one of the reasons we have done nothing is that we have become increasingly polarized over that period of time. We have become increasingly entrenched in our dogma, and we tend to collect only those facts that support our dogma and ignore those that do not. I always make the point that if the melting ice caps don't get us or the rising sea levels don't get us, we're all going to drown in the viscera of each other's gourd oxen. And what I have tried to do in this book, and what I continue to try to do, is to change the narrative, is to turn around and talk about the gray area. I don't know that you can call exploring the gray area education, but it does, I think, begin to change the dialogue.
See, I think exploring the gray area is the education. Because, I mean, you think about energy. I mean, there is no perfect energy source in this country. I mean, everything has its pluses and its minuses. You know, you're trying to navigate that gray area to the best of a bunch of not terribly perfect, you know.
Which ultimately comes down to a leap of faith. And that ultimately comes down to what I was talking about before, character. Information, hard information, is only going to take you so far. You know, that's why we have judgment. That's why we have spines.
I mean, I used to structure initial public offerings for a living for companies. And, you know, in my early career, I would create these huge mathematical models for companies that were, you know, looking out X number of years. And the models would get, you know, as I could see as I got further and further along, these models would get more and more elaborate, especially by sort of, you know, I was then, you know, 10 years into my career. The people who were doing what I did 10 years ago were creating these more elaborate models. But what you realized is it was just so much noise and so much data. But if you really looked, you could find that line of the things that mattered, and, you know, and then you make your judgment based on that.
And it resonated.
Yeah.
And that's important.
You know, you can have so much data that you get overwhelmed.
Great. I have a question. I hope it's not tangential, but someone mentioned conservation, and this is something that, talking about facts, I don't know where these facts came from, but when I was small and Jimmy Carter was president of the country, my father was something, vice president, let's say, of the Solar Energy Research Institute. And he came home one night and said, you know, all that stuff, this is all fine. But if we conserved energy, we could reduce our energy needs by 40% in this country. So I don't know what that number is.
60%.
But it's a big number. So my question is, why doesn't that resonate? Why has that not resonated? Oh, sorry, the Jimmy Carter reference, I still recall. He went on television and said, I'm turning down the temperature of the White House, and he put on his sweater. And people laughed. It had no resonance. Why do you think that's the case?
You know what? Don't dismiss it out of hand.
No,
The United States in the last 7 years has dramatically reduced its carbon output. We are now back at 1992 levels in terms of our output of carbon. Okay, and we are there for 3 reasons. We have, and just to give you an idea of how much we have reduced our carbon. We have reduced our carbon output by an amount equal to the total carbon output of a mid-sized European country, like, say, England, where the Industrial Revolution began. And we have done that for 3 reasons. The first is, for the last several years, we have been locked in periods of no and very slow economic growth. Economic growth drives carbon emissions. We've been at 1 to 2%. That is one reason. Another reason has been, quite frankly, and this is controversial, the fact that if I were to have been talking to you, when I do my talks, I very often walk in and I point out that I say something that's too clever by half. I say, you know what, the USDA recommends that you all get 15 milligrams of iron every day, and I will guarantee that half of you are not going to get your 15 milligrams of iron, but I'm not going to throw stones because I live entirely on caffeine and nicotine, and then I throw stones. A couple months ago, I used to throw 19.64 pounds of coal onto the floor. And the reason I threw 19.64 pounds of coal onto the floor was that was the daily per capita consumption in the United States. Every one of you, every single day, was burning 19.64 pounds of coal. In order to get that 19.64 pounds of coal, they would have to remove 16 times that much earth, roughly a quarter ton of earth. In other words, every one of you was removing about a grave's worth of earth every single day. That's now down to 18 pounds per person. 50% of this electricity 4 years ago would have come from coal. Right now, 36% of it does. And as a result of that diminished coal consumption, we've reduced our carbon output. It is not perfect. It's being replaced predominantly by two things. Renewables in this country have increased dramatically over the last couple of years. They still account for around 10 to 14% of what we consume. We had a record year, by the way, last year when coal itself increased by, when hydro itself increased by 14%, but that was only because of record rains brought about by weather instability. So you have something you can thank coal for. Okay. The other reason is natural gas. When I say explore the gray areas, it's the gray area. But the third reason is conservation. The third reason is that we've been dragged kicking and screaming, resisting every step of the way toward more energy efficient vehicles, toward more energy efficient appliances. It's not enough, but it's a step in the right direction. One of the hurdles we have to overcome in order to advance that is exactly the memory you brought up. Because we constantly, when we think of conservation, when we think of moving forward, we have a tendency to pit it against our own comfort. We have a tendency to look at the dour schoolmaster, who I think was a visionary in a lot of the areas of energy and conservation, but who came across as the most just sanctimonious son of a bitch in the world. And as a result, we have this sense that in order to go in that direction, it has to be painful. It does not.
See, I think that, I agree with what you said. The scary thing for me, and maybe it's because I lived in Hong Kong and China for a long time, is India and China are scarier in some ways. And actually, I was at a discussion here at Princeton a few years ago, and as I was in this discussion, we were talking about, it turned out a lot of people had lived overseas, and which is actually more frightening, in terms of consumption going forward, India or China. And I think people were, India because of population growth, the speed of population growth. But in some ways, I wonder, I was wondering whether the argument could be made that China is scarier from the perspective of, if you have somewhat of a one-child family policy still, you have two parents working, all the resources going to that one child, who is then basically trying to raise their standard of living as quickly as possible, which would then lead to, greater use of energy and greater use of resources versus larger families.
This is absolutely true, but it goes beyond India and China. Whatever progress we make here means nothing if it happens within our borders, right? Because our borders don't care. Carbon doesn't care about our borders. But even more than just India and China and the growing affluence in Asia, there are 1.5 billion people in this world who have no access to clean water or education, to regular and modern health care, because they have no access to electricity, and they are beginning to demand it, and they will get it. And so the question is, what do we do to account for that growth?
And it's also very, I think it puts us in the United States in a position where you can't say, well, you can't have that because because basically we've already polluted the world as much as we have. Yeah, it doesn't make any sense, and so you need to deal with the reality that people in other parts of the world are trying to get to the standard of living we have here, and what the consequences are going to be, and how do you buffer that in some way, and basically not do what we did through our Industrial Revolution, but have a better way of going about it.
Do you have any ideas?
I wish. Well, no, but actually, it was interesting. There was a period. I don't know if it's happening so much anymore, but there was a lot of bashing of China because of the resources that China has been using in terms of their industrial development, but I feel somehow that China has compressed into 20 years what it took the United States and Europe 100 years to realize. And hopefully, it seems they're learning from our lessons. The question is, can they learn quickly enough?
Understand that coal, gas, oil-fueled growth in China has done something beneficial for us as well. One of the reasons you've seen the expansion of solar as much as you have in the United States is because the Chinese have effectively Walmarted us. They have effectively driven down the price of solar voltaic panels, okay? Which is probably not the optimal technology, but it's really useful right now. So again, it doesn't go in just one direction, but it has to be an answer that transcends borders, absolutely. And China is. They are burning more coal than anybody. Look, you look at easy answers. I'm sure you've all heard that a year ago, after the Fukushima incident, Germany swore off nukes. Okay, we're going to get rid of nukes. Their carbon output went up dramatically because they started burning brown coal. And you can take a step, but understand that every step carries a consequence. So it's a question of balancing those things.
Do we have?
Yeah, we have definitely more time. Does someone else have?
Yeah.
You go first.
Where does natural gas fit into this whole equation?
John Hanger, who was the Secretary of the Department of Environmental Protection in the state of Pennsylvania, talks about, and it's a very controversial idea, the idea of it as a bridge fuel. He wants it to be a very wide and very short bridge. If I were to tell you where I stand on it, I tend to share that point of view. And we were talking before about canals. And I see a paradigm. I see a historic paradigm for natural gas. Look, don't make no mistake. Natural gas is risky as hell. It carries with it the risk of surface water contamination, mostly from surface spills. It carries the risk of air pollution, not only just drifting methane, which is in and of itself a very pernicious greenhouse gas. One of the great ironies is when T. Boone Pickens tells us that this is the great, the energy that can supplant all other energies. When they drill for natural gas, they still use diesel to get it. Okay. And in fact, if you look at what most of the spills in the state of Pennsylvania have been, and in Texas, they have not been fracking fluid. What they've been is diesel, or diesel related. Okay. So there are risks of surface water contamination. There's risk of drifting methane, which is a significant problem in areas like Pennsylvania. Always has been. It's exacerbated by this. There are less risks associated with subterranean contamination. That's probably only happened in 2 places in the United States. Both of them are unique. One of them is a place called Pavilion, Wyoming, where rather than 7,500 feet below the aquifers, as the Marcellus is in most of its places, most of its most active areas, it's 700 feet through coal beds in Pavilion, and the other is a place in West Virginia where they actually drilled right into the aquifer in the 1980s because nobody knew what was down there. So there were real and profound risks.
It's being built as the great savior.
I argue that if you can turn around and use quite frankly, the instincts of the industry against it. Okay, the industry is driven by greed, and if you can use the industry's greed, and there are ways to do this, you can manage those categories of problems. But the point is, and Terry Engeller is a professor at Penn State, the guy who first put the numbers on the Marcellus and really kicked off the Marcellus land rush, and he, as he put it to me, he says, when all is said and done, this is still a fossil fuel, and if we're still burning this stuff in 30 years, we're screwed. So the idea is to turn around and use it as a fuel to build our turbines, our wind turbines, to do these 7,000-acre facilities that are going to be required to provide energy for 440,000 homes. They're going to have to be repeated thousands of times in order to provide energy for 350 million people. but to do it with the idea that you're going to make it obsolete. Now, it is, you might think it's naive
What
to
are the odds?
believe that, you might think it's naive to believe that an industry would make itself obsolete. But the canals up in the Holmesdale, Pennsylvania area, Holmesdale, Pennsylvania canals used to run from the foot of the Music Mountains to the Delaware River. And they would carry coal, steel, timber, and iron from the anthracite fields of northeastern Pennsylvania over the mountains on a gravity railroad into the barges that would carry them to New York and Philadelphia, where they would be fashioned into railroads, the very things that made the canals obsolete. There is a historic paradigm for this. These guys did it for the money. And you can use the instincts of the industry against itself.
Maybe just to follow on that, it seems to me that there's a little bit of a paradox in the sense that probably one of the things that's driving the development of the Marcellus Shales and other natural gas deposits is this desire that we have for cheap energy. And we've seen that with the price of natural gas in this country over the last few years. But that in turn seems to undermine the economic incentives around developing solar and wind and other alternatives.
All I can tell you is that I can point to Pennsylvania, okay, where the Marcellus has been, okay, and what has happened there is that we have had an explosion in solar, we've had an explosion in wind, we've had an explosion in these that has gone along with it. Now, part of the reason is that we've had federal incentives in place. Part of the reason is that we have state incentives in place. If you remove those, then you've got a problem. The biggest problem, I think, in slowing or halting this is not the impact it would have on solar and on wind, because I think those are being driven by a growing awareness. They're being driven by favorable market conditions. I think it's the impact you have on coal. Right now, natural gas and wind and solar are price competitive with coal. If you change that equation, it's not going to be wind that's going to gain. It's not going to be solar that's going to gain. It's going to be coal that gains.
Further questions?
I have one more. So since each of you works on a daily basis with the Delaware watershed, what do you see as the greatest threat in your work to the ecosystem of the watershed?
I feel like where we are is constantly under assault of different kinds. Whether it's a power line that's trying to expand through the park, or a pipeline, or the threat of water contamination from Marcellus Shale drilling. All of those things are threats that forest fire. I mean, it just goes on and on. But it's a matter of trying to limit those as best you can. Certainly if we're looking at it from a perspective, just diverting back to your earlier question of the different energy resources, it's important to look at the life cycle cost of the energy, from the initial, whether it's putting the hole in the ground or mining the coal, to the cleanup effects, whether those are cleaning up air pollution or water pollution or all of those things. Because it's interesting, what the only industry is that puts cleanup costs into their equation in terms of figuring out what the costs are? Nuclear. Exactly, nuclear. That's it. No one else, when you look at a cost, it's only nuclear that includes that, which somehow, in my mind, just sounds just ridiculously ironic that that's the case.
Yeah.
But that's,
it's a tragedy that we're not, it's a tragedy that across the board we're not paying the full cost for the energy that we use.
And that probably comes to to the earlier question about the cost of bringing down energy, and I think it's a false economy to say that the natural gas will bring down the costs. You need to look at what the fully cost is for it, because
absolutely,
we pay that price
all of those, natural gas, wind and solar, and right now we need to carry those. We need to carry those. does, okay? And the reality is, for all these guys who turn around and say that, you know, they want to pull the rug out from underneath wind and solar, the reality is if it were not for federal funding, direct federal funding, this very technology that they're using to do this would never have been, you know. But the thing is when that 19.64 pounds of coal that I was throwing, you know how much that 19.64 pounds of coal cost me to buy? Your daily allotment of coal?
$3.
$2. So until you can build parity with that, and that was retail, by the way. That was, I want 19.64 pounds.
19 tons.
Yeah, right, 19 tons, you know, it's pennies on that. My answer to that is that there are, I say this about fracking, but I say this about all of the issues that are facing us. The two most dangerous chemicals that are used in energy production don't appear on a manifest anywhere. They're testosterone and adrenaline. And until we can get beyond the idea of arrogance and fear.
Yeah, one thing to add to Andrew's question, what we see on the boat, I mean, last year there were 2 major hurricanes, right? So unfortunately, the steamboat can't, we just have to tough it out. We can't take that 16-ton boat out. There's a hurricane coming, but the river level went to just below the what they call the free bridge in Lambertville. And now, you know, this year, almost drought conditions where we can't hardly sail. And, you know, I'm not an expert on meteorology or anything, but I suspect it's related, those floods. I don't know if you guys talk about that, but it's related to energy and population. So we always point that out, you know, so when the kids come, they get out of their buses and everything, and the river's way down there, we say, well, the river was up here where you're standing last fall. And all the debris is still there, so it's part of the story.
The other thing is the historical context. I mean, you were saying earlier about, you know, the tree growth near where we live. There's this wonderful picture up at the Pinchot Mansion of when this huge stone mansion was built, and you can see all the way down to the Delaware River. There is not a tree in sight, and now, you know, you can't see the town, you can't see the river. The trees have all grown up. The other thing is, you know, the water quality in both the Hudson and the Delaware rivers has improved.
Absolutely.
Which is, you know, so, you know, you have to look at the positives. You know, with an effort, we can actually change that in a positive way.
With 17 coal-fired power plants within the Delaware River watershed. And anybody who tells you that cap and trade doesn't work, it worked with sulfur, it will work with carbon. One of the reasons that we have been able to reduce some of the impacts is because of what we were able to do with sulfur and those coal mines, or in those coal pot fire, powered fire.
Yeah, and I think at this point, thank you so much to our panelists, and we will have time afterward for everyone to go up and talk. So
Great.
Andrew Merkin, say a few words.
Oh,
Well,
sorry.
so first of all, thank you, and a little round of applause. So it occurred to me as I was listening, one of the things that the main thing that we do here at Princeton Alumni Corps is figure out how to engage individuals in creating solutions to major public issues like our sort of energy crisis, the threats that we face from climate change and environment. And each of you has unique, but in some ways sort of fascinatingly similar story around the happenstances of your lives that cause you to become engaged in a major public issue and dedicate the rest of your life to addressing that issue, whether it's sort of through a chance acquaintance of growing up with some of these kids, sort of being a volunteer and then being recruited from volunteer into board leadership and then being recruited into executive leadership. That's a story we know pretty well here at Alumni Corps. And then also to having somebody show up at your front door and say, guess what, you live on really valuable land. So this has been really instructive for me, at least, and hopefully for everybody else, in thinking about what is it that catalyzes each of us as individuals to engage in shared action to solve public problems. So thank you very much. I also want to say thank you to Kev Kasdan and to Rachel Benevento for putting on this event. Rachel and Kev curate the Turning Point series as we talked about as part of the Community Volunteers Program. I do hope that each of you who is just learning about community volunteers and Princeton Alumni Corps this evening will take this opportunity to speak with Kev, Rachel, myself, or any of the staff about the organization, and specifically about the community volunteer opportunities that we still have open. And also, I do want to mention again that Seamus has some copies of his book for sale here. It's a riotous read, as you might guess. So I encourage you to buy it. One last note: our next panel in the Turning Point series will be in February. It will be focused on child advocacy, and Teacher Randy from Court appointed some special advocates. So with that, we have about 30 minutes to socialize, network, and chat.
Absolutely. Can I definitely smoke a cigarette though? I'm sorry.